So let's briefly summarize the thermodynamics of the biosphere. Why is it useful? Sounds a bit far-fetched, but I hope you got quite a few insights from this short series here of videos. Probably just to quickly recap. So we talked about entropy, the elephant in the room. We saw that it is more than heat because it also deals with radiation and with molecules, with electrons, and that really is, the whole Earth system is about these energy conversions and entropy changes, and that the second law applies everywhere, including the biosphere. When it comes to why entropy is relevant, well, one is about setting a direction, but it also sets limits, and that's sort of really becoming more interesting. We saw that the ability to perform work is constrained by entropy. A practical example is a power plant, and we've seen that some Earth system processes just deplete low entropy sources, just produce entropy, don't perform work, and there are others that can actually perform work out of sunlight. And the ones we've seen is, basically heat engines, or these power plants, the natural power plants that generate, for example, atmospheric motion. And we have seen that photosynthesis falls into that category, and photovoltaics as well. And then we have also seen that actually the atmosphere seems to work at the limit. That's the maximum power limit that we've seen. And that with that, one can actually predict very well climate, one can predict temperatures, one can predict the surface energy balance, how much water can maximally evaporate. So that sets then practical limits to climate processes. Then we looked at what is life, looked at Schrödinger's formulation that, life is, or the biosphere is a dissipative process. Photosynthesis generates disequilibrium. Consumers and metabolisms deplete that disequilibrium. So in that context, it's basically the biosphere or life is chemical disequilibrium, and also just a thermodynamic process, if you want. Then we looked at what limits life, particularly of photosynthesis on land, and we've seen that it is actually not thermodynamics itself, but it is really sort of an indirect limitation of thermodynamics in terms of bringing the mass to the leaves, to the photosynthetic centers. Basically, photosynthesis relies on the atmosphere to perform the work of delivering the reactants to where the leaves are and doing the photosynthesis. And with that, one can actually explain the limits to photosynthesis quite well, and its really low efficiency. And then we looked at the application of this to Earth history. We have seen that there were dramatic changes in CO2 and oxygen. And when we look at this thermodynamically, what it actually shows is that photosynthesis was the main process that developed and created this massive disequilibrium between, so it took CO2, converted it into what's called reduced carbon. So that means that it takes the O2 basically out of the carbon, if you want, in a simplified way. And so you create some carbon on the one hand side, and you create oxygen on the other hand side. So that's disequilibrium. And over the millions of years, it led to the deposition of hydrocarbons, and so it created a massive disequilibrium. It reduced CO2 and it increased O2 as a consequence of that. We then also looked at, probably that resulted in a climate that's more suitable to life. It related it to the Gaia hypothesis that actually life optimizes its environment to maximize its benefit. And thermodynamically, that would basically mean, you maximize the power of the biosphere and make it most active. So it didn't seem quite so far-fetched anymore. Then we can apply the same thing also to humans and the current climate, and also future climates. There we've seen that human societies, we basically live off the disequilibrium that the biosphere generated, that generated in terms of producing food. That's to dry, that we consume that to maintain our metabolisms, and in terms of these fossil fuels that that we use in our industrialized societies. So basically we are reducing that planetary disequilibrium to make our own living, and by that we deteriorate all the work that the biosphere has done to actually establish a habitable, livable climate. And so I also showed that with thermodynamics, one can see that combustion is actually inefficient, and that the answer is, well, put simply, photovoltaics and electricity. Because photovoltaics is a lot more efficient than photosynthesis, so we can generate useful work in the form of electrons in terms of electricity, and by doing so we can achieve the same goal much more efficiently with electricity-based technologies and with technologies that are based on quantum physics. And we stop combustion, and by that we avoid the problem of emitting CO2. So, in other words, it's well worth the effort. And then we also looked sort of in the future. So when you're thinking about advanced societies, actually would then form another way to actually add a process that performs work on a planetary system. So it's not just heat engines, but it's not just photosynthesis, but it's also photovoltaics that adds to this work done by a planet, and that would probably make the planet more powerful in the future. And I think that has some kind of, if you want, some astrobiological consequences, because one can also think more in terms of abstractly, in terms of what's actually a habitable environment, and what do civilizations, if there are some out there, what do they do to the planet? That's probably exactly what they do. They create a planetary environment that is able to perform more work and not destroy the basis of their existence. Okay, well, so at the end, I hope you learned something from this. I'm still fascinated by entropy, and I hope that you also see entropy now as something that is more relevant and also actually quite useful to understand the biosphere and its setting inside the Earth system. And if you have any comments or questions, you're welcome to comment on the video or just send me emails. You see my contact details here below in the bottom. Yep, thank you, and see you again in some other videos.